Hi, I'm Jonathan Hafitz, and welcome to Law and Film, a podcast that explores the rich connections between law and film. Law is critical to many films. Film, in turn, tells us a lot about the law. In each episode, we'll examine a film that's noteworthy from a legal perspective. What legal issues does the film explore? What does it get right about the law, and what does it get wrong? How is law important to understanding the film? And what does the film teach us about the law and about the larger social and cultural context in which it operates? Our films today are the Caine Mutiny from 1954 and the Caine Mutiny Court-Martial from 2023. The 1954 film, The Caine Mutiny, is based on Herman Wouk's best-selling Pulitzer Prize-winning novel of the same name. The film, which was directed by Edward Dmytryk and produced by Stanley Kramer, portrays the fictitious events on board the USS Caine, a Navy destroyer-minesweeper in the Pacific during World War II. Executive Officer Lieutenant Stephen Maryk, played by Van Johnson, relieves the seemingly unstable Lieutenant Commander Philip Francis Queeg, captain of the USS Caine, of his command after Queeg, played memorably by Humphrey Bogart, endangers the ship and its crew during a cyclone. The ship returns to the U.S. and Maryk is court-martialed for mutiny. He's represented by Navy lawyer Lieutenant Barney Greenwald, played by José Ferrer, who, despite disapproving of Maryk's actions, believes Maryk was misled by the ship's communications officer, Lieutenant Tom Keefer, played by Fred MacMurray, into overturning Queeg's command. Maryk is acquitted after Greenwald effectively places Queeg on trial by exposing Queeg's erratic and paranoid behavior. The Caine Mutiny Court-Martial from 2023, directed by the late William Friedkin, is based on Wouk's adaptation of his own 1952 novel for the stage. In contrast to the 1954 film, the Caine Mutiny Court-Martial covers only the court-martial trial. The cast includes Jake Lacy as Maryk, Jason Clarke as defense attorney Greenwald, Monica Raymond as prosecutor Lieutenant Commander Katherine Challee, the late Lance Reddick as Captain Luther Blakley, the presiding judge, and Kiefer Sutherland in a phenomenal performance as Queeg. The films are not only fantastic courtroom dramas, but also explore larger themes around military justice, ethics, and morality. With me to discuss these films is Eugene Fidell. Eugene Fidell, or Gene as I know him, is a visiting lecturer in law and senior research scholar at Yale Law School. In addition, he's of counsel at the Washington, D.C. firm Feldman and Leifer, LLP, where his practice focuses on military legal matters. After his graduation from Harvard Law School, Gene served in the U.S. Coast Guard and attended the U.S. Naval Justice School in Newport, Rhode Island. Gene is the co-founder of the National Institute of Military Justice. He's litigated numerous cases in the military justice system and federal courts, including as defense counsel for Bo Bergdahl, the U.S. Army soldier who was court-martialed for desertion after leaving his post while serving in Afghanistan and being captured by the Taliban. Gene's books include Military Justice, Cases and Materials by Carolina Academic Press, and Military Justice, a very short introduction by Oxford University Press. I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with Gene for many years, starting after the 9/11 attacks with the representation of the Guantanamo detainees, where Gene was the go-to person for any question about how the U.S. military justice system worked in military law. Gene, it's great to have you on the podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with a very basic question. Tell us a little bit about what a court-martial is, structure, basis, and how it differs, how it's similar to and differs from a kind of regular civilian criminal proceeding.
A court-martial is a specialized tribunal. It's a criminal court. Its jurisdiction is confined to criminal offenses under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, otherwise known as the UCMJ. Many of the rules are set forth in a very thick book about the size of the old Bronx telephone directory, the Manual for Courts-Martial. And the new edition has just come out, the 2024 edition, which I'm sure all listeners will want to get a copy of, and they can get it for free online. Basically, as I said, it's a criminal proceeding. It results in a criminal conviction. In many respects, it's just like a trial in federal court, and in some critical respects, it's unlike a trial in federal court. For example, similarities: the same burden of proof applies. The government has to prove its charges beyond a reasonable doubt. The strict rules of evidence apply. There are lawyers on both sides. But there are also major differences. For example, the presiding officer is not a judge enjoying the protection of life tenure. In the military justice system, trial judges have only 3-year terms of office, which many people, myself included, believe is not sufficient to provide the necessary independence. In addition, there's no grand jury requirement so that you can be brought to trial by a court-martial, basically on the basis of a preliminary hearing conducted by a judge advocate. A judge advocate is simply a uniformed lawyer. There is an appeal process. I should add, by the way, that the accused or the defendant in a court-martial has a right to a free lawyer, even if the defendant can pay for a lawyer himself or herself. Those lawyers are uniformed, but you can bring a civilian lawyer if you want. The prosecutor is also going to be a uniformed lawyer. After trial, the appeal process kicks in, and there are several levels of appeal in each branch of the service. There is something called the Court of Criminal Appeals. The Navy and the Marine Corps share one, as do the Air Force and the Space Force. After that, appeals can go to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, which is a court of civilians, although a number of the judges turn out to be retired military or people who have had long military experience. After that, the defendant or appellant can seek review by the Supreme Court of the United States. And I'm happy to say that only recently Congress passed and President Biden signed a measure that gives military personnel for the first time equal access to the Supreme Court, along with the access enjoyed by all federal district court criminal defendants, all state court criminal defendants, and even the people at Guantanamo. So that's a short version.
That's a great summary. And just on the decision makers in, I guess, let's say a general court-martial, which is the most typical court-martial and the one that we have in both movies, who's making the decisions in the case itself?
Today, there is a military judge who presides, and we'll get to that, I'm sure, in our conversation, as well as something like a jury. Personally, I believe the military board or panel, the so-called members of the jury, are very much like jurors, except that they're not required to be a jury of peers. The jury is, by default, composed of commissioned officers. Enlisted people who are tried before a court-martial have a right to request a certain representation on the court-martial itself, and they often do exercise that right. But what you're not seeing, except in capital cases, and the military justice system can impose the death penalty, and I'll say a word about that in a minute, except in death penalty cases, the jury doesn't have to be 12, and it doesn't have to be unanimous, again, except in death penalty cases. So there are some significant differences. The people on the jury, they're not randomly selected off the voter registration list or the motor vehicle list. They're handpicked according to statutory criteria like experience, education, judicial temperament, that kind of thing. So it's importantly different from the conventional jury that we're so accustomed to. The Uniform Code of Military Justice does provide for the death penalty that can only be imposed by a general court-martial. And although a number of death penalty sentences, capital sentences, have been handed down, the last military execution was in 1961. This is not a bloodthirsty jurisdiction. Cases often linger for years and years and years, much like in the civilian criminal justice system. It's a system that is very slow to judge a death sentence and even slower to execute anybody. And interestingly, executions require the affirmative personal decision of the President of the United States.
Let's talk about mutiny. So mutiny, which is the crime, the alleged crime at issue in the films and the book, right? Everything centers around this. And when we talk about mutiny here, it's not sort of like this image of a violent uprising of seamen with cutlasses or rifles. I mean, this is like fairly...
And eye patches.
Eye patches. No eye patches. This is basically kind of almost a bureaucratic relieving of the Captain Queeg, of his command on the vessel.
Right.
This is described as, I understand, the most serious of all maritime and military crimes. William Winthrop, in his landmark treatise, Military Law and Precedent, says, of the acts which the Articles of War make punishable, the principal mutiny has commonly been characterized as the gravest and most criminal of offenses known to the military code. That's a reference to the Articles of War, which is the old version of the U.S. military law, now what you referred to before as the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So this is a very serious crime. And as I understand it, in the Navy, the U.S. Navy had objected or had concerns about the use of mutiny in the title of the 1954 film, as well as for showing the captain of a ship is mentally unstable. And there were revisions to the script over about 15 months of negotiation. I think was also part of a condition for the Navy cooperating by giving the production team access to the planes, aircraft carriers, destroyers, combat boats, as well as Pearl Harbor and the port of San Francisco and Naval Station Treasure Island for location shooting. It really is shot on location, the 1954 film. And so the 54 film opens with this. There's never been a mutiny in a ship of the U.S. Navy.
That's not true, actually, but we can go on.
Okay, well, come back to that. I'll definitely want to hear what you have to say. So, and then Lance Reddick, who plays the presiding judge in the 2023 film, elaborates on how severe this crime is. What can you tell us about mutiny and why is it such a serious crime?
It's a serious crime because obedience to commanders is critical in the administration of any military unit. If you don't have obedience, all you have is an armed mob. And you cannot achieve the objective of a military unit if there isn't discipline. And the locus classicus of discipline is that people not try to oust the person in charge. So it's kind of simple. And actually, if you go back to Herman Melville's wonderful novella, Billy Budd, the whole setting there is an era of anxiety about mutiny in the days of sailing ships. Sailing ships they didn't have nuclear power, they didn't have steam engines, they were on their own, and they would go off and sail around the world and sometimes be gone for years under very arduous conditions where people would die of scurvy or, a variety of mishaps. Poor navigational charts led to endless groundings and collisions. It's no wonder that captains of naval vessels had to rule with an iron fist. It was an environment in which obedience was essential, unquestioning obedience. This all gets back to the USS Caine. Discipline was ensured by means such as the cat o' nine tails, that is to say, flogging, which the U.S. Navy didn't get rid of until well into the 19th century. So basically, effect an insurrection, to use the current term, aboard a naval vessel was a dreadful outcome. Mutinies tended to be famous. The mutiny on the Bounty, for example, very evocative and, engaging tale. There's a current book about a ship called the Tiger, another Royal Navy ship. There was, in fact, contrary to, I gather, what's in the foreword to the 54 film, there was, in fact, a mutiny on a U.S. naval vessel called the Somers, Somers. The brig Somers was on patrol in the Caribbean. There was what struck the CO of the ship as the beginnings of a mutiny. And as a result, a midshipman on board was hanged. Famously, this is Midshipman Sinclair. The problem was that Mr. Sinclair's father was the Secretary of War. Needless to say, this landed like a lead balloon when word of it got back to Washington, and a major investigation was conducted, and it was not a high point for the Navy. I was once involved as counsel in what certainly looked like a mutiny. There was a disturbance, a racial disturbance on a U.S. Coast Guard cutter that tied up at Governor's Island that was broadly referred to as the Gallatin Mutiny. Coast Guard cutter Gallatin had at one point seen the officer of the deck disarmed, and that was treated quite seriously until ultimately the government's case fell apart for other reasons. So mutiny is a very serious matter. The penalties are severe, potentially. And the good news is that they're extremely, extremely rare. And actually, while I'm at the store, I'll mention that actually the U.S. Navy and all the services have really quite a good record for discipline. These are well-trained, well-behaved forces. The court-martial load is way down. The number of courts-martial held in the course of a year is much less than it used to be. Part of that is related to the downsizing of the military generally, but part of it also is effective leadership, effective training, effective selection of personnel, and the kind of values that we look for.
It's really interesting you say that about how it evolved, where ships were gone for a year, 2 years or more. And a world unto itself. I'm thinking out of the book, The Wager, the David Graham book.
That's the book I was thinking of. Thank you.
It'll be interesting to see what Martin Scorsese does with that. They were just trying to go through Straits of Magellan, and they were just basically off for years. Yeah, and there is kind of a tension because as a result, the commander has to have this very broad authority, which can be abused. Let me ask you, what's the legal issue in the movies? Is there a defense that's available to Maryk for taking over the ship? What does the case turn on legally?
Well, a person who tries to supplant the lawful commander of a naval vessel is rolling the dice. The Navy regulation that lies at the heart of both movies provides that in some limited circumstances, officers of a naval vessel's crew, the members of the wardroom, can supplant a commanding officer. But needless to say, given what I already said about the need for discipline, this is really playing with fire. This is not for the faint of heart to undertake, to exercise the right that regulation confers. It's a regulation that makes perfect sense. Because you can have a captain of a ship, a warship, who may be disabled, may be operating with a mental disability, a physical disability, may reveal traits of character that are sort of incompatible with performing the kind of extraordinary responsibilities that the CO of a naval ship, even in this era of instantaneous communication, the internet, satellites, and so forth, there still is a sense in which the captain's word has to be law on a naval vessel. Among other things, the stakes are very high because we live in an era where international relations are fraught, where a misstep can provoke hostilities, and where, among other things, the closest adherence to international law, the law of armed conflict and so forth, has to be assured. So all that said, it's a safety valve. The regulation is a safety valve that's necessary, but you invoke it at your peril.
And the risk is, in the 1954 film, it was a capital crime. I think Maryk in the 2023 film was facing like 15 years in prison if he was convicted. But you don't know. There's no way to know beforehand, right? So you're rolling the dice.
You are rolling the dice. And I forget what the authorized punishment is or was, but traditionally, military court-martial punishments are not built the same way federal sentences are. In other words, there are no sentencing guidelines at the moment in courts-martial. So it's punished as a court-martial may direct up to a maximum provided either by Congress or by the president in the manual for courts-martial. But in any event, you're facing quite draconian penalties.
In the films and on the USS Caine, maybe it was a gray area, but there seemed to be some basis for what Maryk does in relieving Queeg of his command. I mean, there seem to be two issues which are related. One, Queeg was paranoid, behaved erratically. There's a question about whether he had a mental disability. The Navy doctor, psychiatrist testified no. And then two, relatedly, how did that impact his command? I mean, he clearly, there are multiple examples, right, in both films where Queeg is behaving arbitrarily. The incident with, for example, when they show a movie and he's not told about it, he bans movies on board. He denies, I think, water to use for showers in the middle of like a heat wave or when it's very hot. The most famous one is with the strawberries, where there was apparently like a quart of strawberries that was taken, it turns out, by people that worked in the mess hall.
In the galley. You mean in the galley?
Sorry, in the galley. Taken in the galley. Thank you, Gene. And Queeg thinks that someone had made a duplicate key, and he goes and turns the ship upside down to try to find this, even though he'd been tipped off that basically the people in the galley had eaten the extra quart or whatever it was of strawberries. But he's clearly acting arbitrarily, or in what, anyway, a layman's view would seem arbitrary.
I suppose you're wondering why I called this meeting. As you all know by now, we had an excellent dessert for dinner tonight, ice cream and frozen strawberries. Well, about an hour ago, I sent Whitaker to the pantry to bring me another portion. He came back with the ice cream, all right. But he said, "Sir, there ain't no more strawberries." Now, gentlemen, I do not believe that the officers of this ship consumed a full gallon of strawberries at dinner tonight, and I intend to prove it. Have any of you gentlemen an explanation for the quart of missing strawberries? There can be no doubt someone else finished them for us. As of now, gentlemen, you are all appointed a board of investigation to find out who's responsible for this theft. Mr. Maryk, you are the senior member.
You mean in the morning, sir?
Now, Mr. Maryk, according to my watch, does not mean in the morning. It means 0147. I expect a full report by 0800.
And that comes to a head when the ship is in a cyclone or a typhoon. It's a storm. It looks like the survival of the ship and its crew is at stake. And Queeg seems frozen, right? He can't act, or he's not making the right decisions. And so Maryk, who's kind of been primed that Queeg is unstable by Kiefer, the communications officer, takes command. So this seems to be, arguably a pretty good example or a pretty good place to invoke the safety valve of quote unquote mutiny.
Remember that the first film was made in 1954. Wouk wrote the book in 52. That was only 7 years after the end of World War II. So viewers and everybody involved in the film, they were personally aware, maybe directly, certainly indirectly, but acutely aware of the war and wartime conditions. And World War II was the genuine article. This is not, steaming off the Gulf of Aden or something like that. Wouk actually served in the U.S. Navy, and he served on a ship called the USS Caine, which became the USS Caine. Quite how that came about, I don't know. But that is the history on it. And he was a junior officer on the ship. And obviously he was writing a book.
Exactly, like Kiefer.
Right, exactly. And there are some humorous aspects, about Kiefer's wry view of the world and the Navy. I think it's important to recognize the special circumstances in wartime. This was a shooting war on a global basis, and the idea of having somebody in command who really might be risking his personnel as well as the unit, the command as a whole. Losing a ship in a typhoon, not a good thing. Or endangering people on shore in a landing operation, not a good thing. So was Queeg crazy to the extent that the regulation required? As a kind of cumulative judgment, you could easily add up the circumstances. For example, Queeg's growing catatonic, apparently out of fear, is very disturbing. Of course, people in command, even when there isn't a shooting war going on, sometimes do aberrant things. Some people who are given command of floating units, naval vessels, may vent their aggressions by becoming screamers, literally screaming at the bridge over one thing or another. Or, it's not unheard of for people to take an exaggerated interest in minor uniform discrepancies. You're wearing white socks with that uniform, they're supposed to be black socks, or you've got a thread loose. There's actually a term for it, not particularly woke, but it's called an Irish pennant if you have a loose thread on your uniform. So there are people who can become petty tyrants. Sometimes that comes with the territory. Other times it becomes pathological. And how to distinguish the one from the other is the challenge. I will say that I once represented a man who was an officer on a Coast Guard cutter in World War II, and he told me a story about strawberry ice cream. And he wasn't making it up. These things happened. That was a great luxury, I'm sure, in the middle of the Mediterranean in his case, but there was an asset of greatly prized foodstuff on a warship. Now, what's the role of psychiatric expertise? If you're trying to bring a commanding officer within the terms of the Navy regulation, you'd certainly want to be able to make a cogent case, a very strong case, in fact, that the person being ousted as CO, commanding officer, really was suffering from some mental defect. Not necessarily, by the way, suffering from a defect that would qualify as an insanity defense, for example. That's not the issue, knowing right from wrong, but it's endangering the vessel. And obviously that judgment has to be balanced against the need for discipline and the need for a stable regime on board the ship. The psychiatric evidence, particularly in the second film, I thought was amusing. One of the government's witnesses had been in the Navy for 5 months. That was not a great selection of an expert witness, I thought. But I thought that the makers of these movies did a quite good job. But of course, the pièce de résistance, the classic evidence, is the evidence provided by Captain Queeg himself. Would the case have come out any differently had there been no psychiatrists and just Queeg? What do you think?
Within the world of the film, I think that the defense is able to obtain the acquittal because they put Queeg effectively on trial and they show how unstable and balanced Queeg could become. Here's a clip of Humphrey Bogart unraveling his Queeg while rolling the steel bearing balls, kind of the iconic image from the film.
I'm afraid the defense has no other recourse than to produce Ensign Harding.
Now, there's no need for that. I know exactly what he'll tell you. Lies. He was no different from any other officer in the wardroom. They were all disloyal. I tried to run the ship properly with a book, but they fought me at every turn. If the crew wanted to walk around with their shirt tails hanging out, that's all right. Let them. Take the tow line. Defective equipment, no more, no less. But they encouraged the crew to go around scoffing at me and spreading wild rumors about scheming in circles and then old Yellowstain. I was to blame for Lieutenant Maryk's incompetence and poor seamanship. Lieutenant Maryk was the perfect officer, but not Captain Queeg. But the strawberries, that's where I had them. They laughed at me and made jokes. But I proved beyond the shadow of a doubt and with geometric logic that a duplicate key to the wardroom icebox did exist. And I'd have produced that key if they hadn't pulled the Caine out of action. I know now they were only trying to protect some fellow officer. And naturally, I can only cover these things from memory. If I've left anything out, why, just ask me specific questions and I'll be glad to answer them one by one.
Now here's Kiefer Sutherland in his role as Queeg becoming unraveled on the stand.
Oh, yes. the movie business. Okay, no respect for command. That was the whole trouble with that ship. The movie operator, who had a disrespectful manner anyways, started the movie without waiting for the arrival of the commanding officer. And out of that whole ship's crew, officers and men, did one person stand up and call a halt or even notice that the captain wasn't present? I missed those movies more than they did. And I banned them, and by God, I'd do it again. What was I supposed to do? Start issuing them all letters of commendation for this gratuitous insult to the commanding officer? It's not like I took it personal. It's the principle. The principle of respect for the command, and that principle was dead when I came aboard that ship and I brought it to life, and I nagged and I bitched and I hollered, and by God, I made it stick while I was captain.
I agree that the defense was able to win by exposing Queeg as unstable and kind of demonstrating through Queeg's own testimony how trying and potentially dangerous his personality had become. What's interesting is, or another interesting thing is that the judge and this is in the 2023 version, the presiding judge played by Lance Reddick, gives a stern warning to the defense counsel as he goes after Queeg and tries to put Queeg on trial.
Let me remind everyone of the serious nature of the issues in this line of questioning and the implications involved. From the earliest days of our service, the worst charge that can be leveled against a naval service officer, especially the commanding officer of the vessel, is that he displays cowardice or negligence in the face of danger to his ship or crew. Counsel and the witness are herewith cautioned that they are treading on dangerous and unprecedented grounds here.
Is this, as the Lance Reddick character says, is the defense counsel treading on dangerous and unprecedented ground for suggesting or questioning not just Queeg's sort of mental stability, but also his potential cowardice in the face of danger? And if so, if this is treading on dangerous and unprecedented ground, doesn't this conflict with the right to a zealous defense? If the lawyer can get chewed out for kind of going after the kind of main witness, prosecution's main witness?
I'll start with the headline. The headline is that my own view, and I watched the movies on consecutive days, the two versions. My headline is that I thought the 2023 version was an act of vandalism. I thought it was a highly derivative and poor copy of the original. I had much the same feeling, by the way, about the remake a couple of years ago of Oklahoma on Broadway. It's a danger of seeing something that somebody else has already done. On the other hand, Hollywood has done this repeatedly over its century of existence. So I'm barking up the wrong tree there. But there's a lot wrong with the trial. To begin with, and I'll look at the 2023 version, military justice practitioners would not take this as a serious attempt to depict the administration of military justice in this era. The gentleman in the middle of the bench acted like a judge, but wasn't wearing robes, and had only 4 other people on the panel. Now, in real life, that officer would have been seated separately at a bench, and the voting members of the jury, the panel, would have been in a jury box. And there would have been, at least at the time, 5, not 4. So there was a lot wrong. And the comment that you quoted, sort of cautionary note, how dare you impugn the courage of this fine officer, and so on and so forth, it struck me as really over the top and sort of simplistic. Sometimes things are better left unsaid. Turning to the members, the panel included a man who looked like he was about 90 years old, who had 14 or 15 rows of ribbons, and was, I think, a rear admiral. Who did he seem to be? You wouldn't have a retiree serving on a court-martial for a lieutenant commander. I mean, it wouldn't happen. There was another person on the panel that I thought, it just didn't sound right. So that struck me as quite unrealistic. Equally unrealistic was the lawyering. There was a woman prosecutor called the trial counsel who was presented as ruthless and shrill and unrealistic. I mean, people who prosecute, some people are more aggressive in the courtroom than others. We all know that. It happens. But this is off the charts, and it became a kind of comic book version of a trial. One thing I was baffled by was that Barney Greenwald, in the second movie, somebody, maybe he points out or somebody else points out, that 8 Navy lawyers had refused to represent Queeg. What's that about? You get assigned to a case, or under the UCMJ, you can request a lawyer by name, and if the person's reasonably available, they have to make that person available. But how does it come about that Navy lawyers, uniformed lawyers, get to say, no, I don't feel like doing that? The only way you could do that is if you were disqualified for some reason, or if you had some deep moral objection, or if you had some vision of the case that was utterly incompatible with the client's desires for how the case should be litigated. But the notion that all 8 Navy lawyers who were approached to handle a case said, no thanks, I'm going to do an AWOL case instead, or whatever, or another drug case or a sexual assault case, that's just ridiculous. And a film loses credibility when you see that. And the other thing is the idea that Barney Greenwald in the 2023 version, who's practicing law somewhere, decides on 9/11 or shortly after 9/11, well, I'm going to put down my law practice, and now I'm going to go into the Navy and become a fighter pilot, a jet fighter pilot at age 30-something, let's say. Who could make this up? I mean, there's a fictional element. Fiction is fine. I like fiction. But, give me a break. It's got to bear some resemblance to the reality that you're purporting to describe. The other thing, this is a small point, but anybody who's been in the service knows that people are expected to spend some time in the barber's chair. And very few people in this cast seem to have visited a barber recently. I mean, seriously. I mean, how much planning and technical advice does it take to say, Mr. Defense Counsel, get a haircut or wear your uniform properly?
They all had good haircuts in the 1954 movie. Everyone was very clean shaven, I think.
Right.
I will say that in the 54 version, there was the same theme of the defense counsel resisting the prosecution, right? Barney Greenwald, played by José Ferrer in the original version, says he'd rather be prosecuting and agrees to defend Maryk only because basically he thinks he's more of a fool than a mutineer, and realizes that Maryk fell under the sway of Kiefer, played by MacMurray, who ginned him up and persuaded him that Queeg was a paranoid and had to be overthrown.
Well, all I can say is in my 3 years, 7 months, and 8 days on active duty, nobody ever said, if you don't want to do this case, you don't have to do this case. And it wasn't a question of whether I liked the client or the accused or not. A lawyer doesn't have to love his client, but there's really quite a lot of unreality to some of the professional interactions. I will say, speaking of Barney Greenwald, by the way, at the end, and it's frankly more effective in the 54 version than in the 2023 version. There's a party at the hotel in San Francisco, and Greenwald comes in and gives a speech about the Queegs of the world, how in peacetime, the Queegs of the world getting paid, really chintzy salaries in the peacetime Navy, and they kept the Navy going, and then we call on them when there's a shooting war. That's probably the most potent, dramatically potent moment, is setting aside, Queeg on the witness stand. That has the deepest moral dimension. What happens at the end of a case? Does everybody go out and have a drink? Or do you have to be drunk in order for the light to go on to say, well, there's a moral dimension to this theatrical performance that we just went through? And by the way, the thing about courts-martial is that they're inherently theatrical. This is not to take anything away from Mr. Friedkin or from Herman Wouk or any of the other people who brought us these movies. I don't think you can make a bad movie about a court-martial. Why is that? Because it's so exotic. People are in costume. From the minute the curtain goes up, so to speak, they're in costume. They're speaking a different language. There's customs and rituals involved. Ritual. It's all inherently theatrical. And it's the individual against the state in a way that's even more potent than the normal criminal prosecution, because the state is there not only as the keeper of order and society, it's the state holding a sword, the state in war. And so the moral and ethical dimensions are turned way up in a wartime court-martial setting. That's why I say it's hard to think of one that's not powerful. The Breaker Morant, for example, is one of the great movies, and there it is again.
Which I covered with Michelle Parody, actually. In my
great.
Yeah,
I didn't
agree. I agree. And I agree with you, Gene. I think the closing scene, it's the final scene in the 2023 version, where post-trial, there's the celebration party for the acquittal of Maryk and for Kiefer's book, which is now, been sold. He sold his book. It's not quite the final scene in the 1954 version, because after the celebration, we see that the ship goes out again with the former commander, De Vries, retaking over and people going on, kind of back, starting the circle again. But it's a powerful scene. And I actually think the Friedkin version is a really good job with it. I'll play the clip now from the 2023 version.
Suddenly seems to me if I wrote a war novel, I would try to make a hero out of old Yellowstain. You see, Mr. Keefer, while I was studying law, and you were writing short stories, and Willie Keith was playing on the fields of Princeton, why, all that time, these old birds we call regulars, these stupid, stuffy pricks were standing guard on our fat, dumb, and happy country. Of course, they were doing it for dough, same as anybody does anything. But the question is, in the last analysis, what do you do for dough? You and me. We're advancing our free little careers. So when 9/11 happened and so many of us rushed to join up to fight those assholes that crashed those planes into the Twin Towers, but there were already a lot of guys ready to do that. Old Yellowstain and guys like him. They're already on station, ready to go. And these old-line pros, they may not be up in the latest video game, but they know how to get a tough job done. And they were standing by and they were ready to do it. While the rest of us was still trying to know shit from Shinola.
Barney, it's over. Come on, let's just enjoy dinner.
Dinner's a sham, Steve. You're guilty. Of course, you're only half guilty. There was someone else standing very neatly out of the picture. The guy who started the whole idea that Queeg's a dangerous paranoiac, who argued you into it for 6 months, who coined the nickname Old Yellowstain, who pointed out the psychiatry books in Article 1108 and kept hammering it at you.
All right, now wait a minute here.
Oh, yeah, Mr. Kiefer, that's right, yeah. I had to drag it out of Steve. Big dumb Polak tried to tell me it was all his own idea. He wouldn't know a paranoid from an anthropoid, but you knew, didn't you? You told him his medical log was a clinical picture of a paranoid. If there is a guilty party, it's you. So if you hadn't filled Steve Maryk's thick head full of paranoia in Article 1108, why, he'd have got Queeg to come north, helped him pull through to the south, and the Caine wouldn't have been yanked out of action. And that is your contribution to the good old USA, my friend. Pulling a minesweeper out of the Persian Gulf when it was most needed. I defended Steve Maryk because I realized the wrong guy was on trial. And the only way I could defend him was to murder Queeg for you. And I'm pissed off that I was put in that position. And I'm ashamed of what I did. Queeg deserved better. He served this country for 21 years. So I'm not going to eat your dinner, drink your wine. I'll make my toast and go.
And so it concludes with the attorney, Barney Greenwald, mock toasting Kiefer and throwing his drink in Kiefer's face. And he's got two claims, right, that are clear. One, they had the wrong person on trial, that Kiefer, not Maryk, was the true author. I love the words author because Wouk's also the author of the mutiny. And then two, kind of what you mentioned, this underlying tension, or I don't know what you call it, between regulars, people like the Queegs of the world, and the reservists or the careerists. And that really, the careerist element really becomes sharper in the 2023 version, where you have these people who are just kind of serving now, partly to kind of advance whatever careers they're in. And both films, I think, come out on the side of Queeg deserved better, right? He served the country, and that there was some injustice done here. Do you kind of agree with that final takeaway?
Yes, I do. Although, ironically, if you look at the very last scene from the 54 movie, the one that you mentioned, where it turns out that the old CO has returned, or that the old CO has resurfaced as commander of a new ship. And there's this wonderful scene where their eyes meet, and there's a kind of tone to the interaction that I thought was very special, particularly when you think back to the hilarious scene when that first CO leaves and somebody has violated rules by offering him a gratuity, namely a gold wristwatch, which he ultimately helps himself to. It's one of the best scenes in the movie.
First he says, I can't do it. It's against,
I can't do that.
The rules. Then he puts it to the side, and then you see him like walking off and pocketing the watch, right?
And then here's this whole movie about violating a regulation. The other thing I think it would be remiss not to focus on for real is the two versions do reflect dramatic changes in the Navy workforce. There were no persons of color in the Wouk version. Not that I remember.
Only as like the people who work the galley.
Right. Traditionally in the Navy, the galley staff, the mess cooks, were Black or Filipino, and there were no women. So, this is a dramatic change. The Navy has changed very, very, very considerably. Women are in position of responsibility. They're COs of warships. There are a lot of women in the Navy JAG Corps, and there's no more racial discrimination that I'm aware of in assignments. I'm glad they did that. It would have been impossible not to do that, actually, but nonetheless, I'm glad they did it. That's a good thing. And they had to make some adjustments. They couldn't have literally remade the 54 version. It wouldn't have been true.
No, those were good updates, right? And they put Monica Raymond in as playing the chief prosecutor and Lance Reddick as the presiding judge. So she's a woman. Lance Reddick, the late great Lance Reddick, was Black. So that really does reflect more modern realities, and that was certainly very good to do.
By the way, I will also say this. The 2023 version is set in a courtroom that looks like a salon out of Versailles. I have never seen a military courtroom, even the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, which is a grand building that was built to house the D.C. Circuit 125 years ago. It doesn't look like that, with oil paintings on the wall. But I guess that's what makes Hollywood go round.
The major update, right, was to shift the context from sort of the height of World War II, the campaign in the Pacific in the 1954 version, to the sort of post 9/11 period where the ship, the USS Caine, is patrolling Persian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz at the time. It's the kind of more general kind of post 9/11 era, which feels a little bit different, right? I think the stakes seem somewhat different.
Sure, the stakes are different, in some ways smaller. But the other thing is, and this is a sociological point about the composition of the Navy, all the armed forces relied very, very heavily on reservists and conscripts in World War II. We haven't had conscription since, I think, 1973 in this country. Those of us who were reserve officers during the Vietnam War often felt that we were tolerated at best by the management. But, I think things have changed from World War II to when I was on active duty. And then from that time, now 50-something years ago, to the present, or to the post 9/11 era in general, further change has occurred. To the good, to the ill, I don't know. Personally, I think conscription is a good thing because it serves as a check on foreign policy and the kinds of things the country does. But some basic things have changed. Some very, very basic things have changed about the U.S. Armed Forces, cannot be denied. And it does come through in these two snapshots.
I want to go back for a minute to the prosecutor's closing. Prosecutor's very tough. And after Queeg, this is after Queeg collapses on the stand, she's got kind of a real challenge in her closing. Here from the 2023 version is Monica Raymond playing the prosecutor in her closing remarks.
Can this court possibly endorse the precedent that a captain who doesn't please his underlings can be deposed by them? And then that the captain's only recourse afterward is to be placed at a witness stand in a general court-martial to answer every petty gripe and justify all his command decisions to a hostile lawyer taking the part of his insubordinate inferiors? Such a precedent is nothing but a blank check for mutiny. It is the absolute destruction of the chain of command. Whatever the verdict on the accused, I formally recommend that Defense Counsel Greenwald be censured by this court for conduct unbecoming an officer of the Navy, and that this reprimand be made part of his record.
Two things here struck me. One is the idea that if you gave an acquittal was a, quote, blank check for mutiny. And then the other, which I think and I expect you're going to say was unrealistic, she makes the motion for defense counsel Jason Clark to be reprimanded or basically calling into question Queeg's honor for conduct unbecoming an officer. So I assume that can't be the case because that's so inconsistent with the kind of a basic fair trial due process that characterizes today's military justice system.
Well, first on prosecutors or defense counsel who make shrill arguments. The defense you kind of hope for is shrill arguments. Interesting. Let's see what this person has to say. But when a prosecutor does it, you run a real risk of losing your audience. And that struck me as not good work. And so obviously not good work that, somebody should have talked to the writer and said, let's redo this scene here. This is not going to work. And as far as making a motion in midstream to have your adversary sanctioned is ridiculous. Actually, there are things to do, which is have the person put on reports if they've manipulated evidence or something like that, or knowingly put a liar on the witness stand who lies and you know it, or withholding evidence if you're a prosecutor in violation of Brady against Maryland, this kind of stuff. There are ways to discipline lawyers. A motion in the courtroom is not the way to do it. It's another one of those things where I just wish somebody had a technical advisor who was willing to say, don't do that because you're going to lose credibility. On the other hand, I'm talking as a person who's been involved with military justice basically over my entire career. It means a lot to me. And I'm not your garden variety person in the audience for this. So I may be hypercritical.
The 1954 movie, I think you were saying, Gene, before, is kind of a product of its period, emerging out of World War II, U.S. in the 1950s, kind of looking back at this period and concerned about how the Navy is depicted. And so Kiefer, the writer, again, it's not based on Wouk, but he was a writer.
Wouk was having fun with us writing Kiefer.
Yeah, I think so too. But the 1954 version did come in for some criticism, actually. And so Arthur Schlesinger assailed the plot, and the story is kind of an attack on intellectuals. And there was sort of a backlash of this, standing behind the Navy. And it's interesting, you could imagine, right, in a different era, 70s, Vietnam era, or the new Hollywood, how they would have portrayed Kiefer. I mean, Kiefer could have been probably the hero. So it's kind of interesting. And then you look at, the 2023 version, looking at the post 9/11 era, which in a sense is kind of like compadre with and on the same page as the 1954 version in trying to basically say they went too far. Maryk and Kiefer, they went too far in maligning Queeg.
I think I would agree with that. I think that's a fair appraisal. But I wasn't aware that Arthur Schlesinger Jr. had heartburn over this.
So, Gene, we've talked about some of the 2023 movie and some of the problems in terms of accurately capturing a court-martial. Anything that stuck out to you about the 1954 version?
Well, one thing that stuck out was some of the great actors that were in it. Humphrey Bogart, for Pete's sake, with those wonderful close-ups. I mean, God, they were good. E.G. Marshall shows up, who later went on to star in The Defenders, one of my favorite shows. And turning to the 2023 version, did I miss the part where the witnesses were sworn in? I don't remember anybody ever being asked, do you swear that the evidence you're about to give in this case shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? It never happens.
It's interesting. Humphrey Bogart, right? He stars as Queeg, and I do think Kiefer Sutherland did a great job. The 1954 version did have a real big cultural impact. I mean, it was the second most popular movie of the year. Humphrey Bogart landed on the cover of Time magazine. So it did kind of resonate in a way. And so it's a movie about court-martial, military justice, but it also can be viewed and has been viewed by some as one of Hollywood's trial movies, right? It's ultimately a trial movie. The Caine Mutiny Court-Martial are a long engagement with Hollywood's approach to trials and whether trials can be seen as a search for the truth. And these movies raise that question in the context of a court-martial with the charge for mutiny.
You want the truth? You can't handle the truth.
Exactly right. To quote another famous court-martial movie, or in a civil action, the Robert Duvall character says, "You want the truth? Find that at the bottom of a well." So, I don't know if this film you think critiques trials as a means of searching for the truth.
No, I actually don't think so. I think this is in the genre of military matters rather than trials as such. That's where I would put it. Things can be in both categories. There was a time that I used to include on my syllabus for military justice courses a list of movies, recommended movies. This obviously was one. A Few Good Men was another. One of my favorite movies is called The Last Detail, which is a movie starring Jack Nicholson. It's a fabulous movie that, unlike the 2023 Caine Mutiny, captured the way of life. Mr. Roberts was another great movie that captures a way of life. Of course, the way of life changes. Everything changes. But the way of life in the U.S. Armed Forces and the U.S. Navy particularly, it certainly has changed. In my own situation, I went into the service in 1969, and there were still ships in the fleet, as well as the Coast Guard fleet, that had been in World War II. Or that had been in service in the 30s. So in 1969, you could say it was even the end of World War II, sociologically. Anyway, we owe a great debt to the filmmakers. Not every movie is going to be a grand slam. And I think that's particularly true where you're attempting to remake something that was a grand slam the first time out. And that takes great courage and conviction to do that. And I actually recommend seeing both of them.
Yeah, I do too, although it sounds like you're a larger fan by a good margin of the 1954 version, the Humphrey Bogart version.
Only because I'm a nitpicker.
And it does give you a little bit more of the life on the ship, which is one of the things I think Herman Wouk was trying to do and does in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, which incidentally goes on even beyond the 1954 movie. It continues on where Kiefer, the communications officer, becomes the CO. And actually starts behaving like Queeg. And there's a kamikaze attack in the Pacific by the Japanese. The ship's in flames and Kiefer just boxes out and fails. And the ensign, Willie Keith, has to take over. So kind of a full circle where Kiefer doesn't just get a drink thrown in his face, but actually is in the position. And, it's not so easy being the CO, I guess. I've never commanded a ship, anything close to it, but I guess maybe that's what Wouk is saying.
Well, I applaud your doing this. It's been fun to chat with you. Now I'm going to see if there's a little strawberry ice cream in the refrigerator.
Make sure you don't take too much. Gene, thanks so much. It's been great having you on the podcast.
My pleasure. Let's keep in touch.
Hi, listeners. On the last episode, I announced a new feature where you can write in with a question about a prior episode, and I'll do my best to answer it. Well, we've got our first question. Richard from Brooklyn writes in with a query about Miracle on 34th Street, which we covered in the last episode, episode 24. The movie includes an attempt to civilly commit Kris Kringle, the Macy's department store Santa Claus, after a run-in with the Macy's psychiatrist on the ground Kris really believes he's Santa Claus. The movie shows us a civil commitment hearing in New York City circa 1947 when the film was made. Richard wants to know, how have civil commitment proceedings changed since then? Thanks for your question, Richard. Civil commitment proceedings have changed in multiple ways. Today, there are greater procedural protections which have been imposed by statute and judicial decisions. Due process now requires that the state prove that, as a result of a mental illness, a person poses a danger to themselves or to others. Moreover, this must be proven by clear and convincing evidence, the second highest standard in the legal system. Additionally, over time, there's been a move away from institutionalization and a greater focus on outpatient treatment as a matter of policy. So in the film, Kris Kringle wins his civil commitment proceeding when the U.S. Post Office, a branch of the U.S. government, acknowledges Kris as the one and only Santa Claus by delivering letters to him that are addressed to Santa. Today, it's more likely the state wouldn't have met its burden and that this postal intervention would have been unnecessary. Richard, I hope that answers your excellent question. And remember, go ahead and send me any questions you have about a prior episode, and I'll do my best to answer them. You can email me at jonathanhafetz@gmail.com. That's Jonathan Hafetz, my first and last name, @gmail.com, or DM me on Twitter or X. Thanks, everyone, and I look forward to your questions.